Now, let's talk more about alleged war crimes being committed in Ukraine. For that, I'm joined now by Kai Ambos. He's a professor of law in Göttingen and counsel at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Thanks for being with us. Professor, investigations are underway into war crimes committed in Ukraine. Could Russia find itself facing charges of crimes against humanity or even genocide?
Well, I would say it's not easy to gather evidence on the ground, and even for war crimes, and the threshold for crimes against humanity and genocide would be much higher. We would have to prove a policy to attack the civilian population, and this policy could only come out of the Kremlin. So it's very difficult. It's difficult enough to identify concrete victims and perpetrators of war crimes on the ground.
Tell us how you go about gathering that evidence in crimes of this nature. Does the ICC have people on the ground, or do you rely on the work of journalists and NGOs in the field?
No, certainly not. With all due respect, we don't rely on the work of journalists, and not even on human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch. I mean, you know, all this evidence, all this kind of information you are finding as investigative journalists or NGOs is not evidence we can use in court. You know, so the problem is that we have many people on the ground. Also, of course, we have the Ukrainians investigating, we have the ICC people, the investigator of the Office of the Prosecutor, and then we have a kind of mess. And then you talk to witnesses, and maybe the 10th time the investigator of OTP will talk to witness, the witness will be tired. So it could be counterproductive to have too many people on the ground in terms of coordination.
U.S. President Joe Biden, he wants Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to be put on trial. Could Putin eventually be held accountable for the actions of his forces?
I think eventually, yes. I mean, the term is, of course, flexible. I mean, we are talking about here years and maybe decades, not days or months. As I said, we have to first establish what we call a crime base. We have to find concrete evidence on war crimes, and we have to impute these war crimes to Russian soldiers, and then we have to go up to the chain of command, you know, to the generals, to the superiors, and maybe to Putin and his entourage. But that's a hard job to do. That's hard investigative work, and that takes time.
Neither Russia nor Ukraine accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. How much of a problem is that?
Well, you are right, they are not state party, they have not ratified the Rome Statute, but Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction under a specific provision. And on that basis, investigations are going on since end of 2013. We should not forget, we are talking here about a situation which only has erupted or has been radicalized by the invasion of February, but we are talking about possible crimes in eastern Ukraine, in the Crimea. And these crimes have been investigated. They are under investigation. Of course, now the focus is on possible war crimes in the context of the invasion, but the jurisdiction is based on a consent by Ukraine as a territorial state.
What about the timeline here? If cases were to actually get to court, how long would it take for a trial to take place? When could we expect to see something happen legally?
Yeah, I mean, legally, we already see something happening, and we are formally now in an investigation of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of The Hague. That's legally an investigation, and it takes the time it takes to find enough evidence, for example, to issue arrest warrants, yes, and to formulate an indictment and to formulate charges. That's the time investigators need, and only the investigators know, and the prosecutors, when they have enough evidence together to bring it before the judges, who have to accept it, like in any criminal justice system, accept this evidence as sufficient evidence to go to trial. That takes time. We have to be patient here.
Professor Ambos, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Kai Ambos, a professor of law in Göttingen and a counsel to the International Criminal Court.
And joining us now for more on this story is Hugh Williamson. He's the director of the Europe and Central Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Hugh, give us an idea of what is needed in terms of investigation, evidence, witness testimonies and so on in bringing a prosecution for alleged war crimes to trial.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, a variety of sorts of evidence is needed. Obviously, high-quality witness testimony from victims or survivors of alleged war crimes. Forensic evidence is very important. The Ukrainian investigation in Bucha, for instance, at the moment, north of Kiev, involves forensic experts, and it's great that the EU and the US have sent those experts to Ukraine. They obviously need to be looking at open source material as well, videos and photos, and verifying that those materials really were made where the video maker says they were made. So these sorts of things coming together and being seen through the legal framework of the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, which define how parties behave in war conditions.
Now, earlier today, we heard from a counsel to the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And he suggested that NGOs and journalists who are reporting on this war could contribute to witness fatigue before the case comes to trial. What's your take on that?
That's an interesting perspective. We hear that sometimes from legal experts. We see our role as gathering evidence as quickly as possible, but meticulously as possible, and not producing and not creating witness fatigue. We're very, very careful when we're interacting with witnesses not to re-traumatize them, to ensure they have social, medical, psychological support. So we think civil society organizations have a role to play alongside, obviously, the official investigators.
Now, could there be grounds for crimes against humanity or genocide, as President Zelensky is alleging?
Well, crimes against humanity is a broad term, and war crimes fall within that. Genocide is a very specific term used for an intended eradication of a whole or part of a group, in this case probably the Ukrainian population. We don't think we're there yet. The evidence is not there, so that's why we think it's important to focus on what is evidently there, the widespread war crimes that Human Rights Watch and others have been identifying: cluster bombs, attacks on civilians, execution and rape by Russian soldiers, but also abuses by the Ukrainian side. Just to mention that, we've published 2 reports about abuses of prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war by Ukraine.
Now, the International Criminal Court has already opened an investigation, but Russia is not a member of that organization. Could we see other countries trying the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine under the legal principle of universal jurisdiction?
Certainly, we encourage other countries to do so. We're in Germany, and we encourage Germany to pursue its investigation that it's announced in principle. Universal jurisdiction is an incredibly important legal tool because it enables a country's judicial system to bring to court people who commit serious crimes, such as war crimes, outside their jurisdiction. We saw it effective in the Syrian case in verdicts last year and in January this year. So we think it's an important tool that could be used more.
Hugh Williamson there of Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has called on the West to provide more weapons as he arrived in Brussels for a meeting with NATO foreign ministers. He criticized the German government for its lack of military support, saying Berlin has time, but Kiev doesn't. NATO has ruled out imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine over fears of escalating the conflict. But member countries are supplying artillery and other weapons to assist with Ukraine's defense efforts. We'll just have some time for some other stories we are following for you on the war in Ukraine. Since their invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces have attacked more than 100 medical facilities. The World Health Organization says more hospitals and healthcare facilities have been attacked around the globe this year than ever recorded. The UN body is calling on the military to avoid such targets. US President Joe Biden has accused Russia of brutality and inhumanity and announced new sanctions in the wake of the atrocities. Biden has also spoken of war crimes, the latest measures drawn up by Russian by Washington target Russian banks and individuals, including the grown-up daughters of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. EU leaders, meanwhile, are pushing to cut off Russian coal imports. They're also considering an embargo on oil and gas. The bloc is preparing to implement a fifth round of sanctions against Moscow. Britain is also drawing up a timetable to end its Russian energy imports.
The German news magazine Der Spiegel says more evidence has emerged of war crimes carried out by Russian troops in the northern Ukrainian town of Bucha. Spiegel says Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, has monitored Russian military communications in which troops can be heard discussing killings in Bucha. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our political correspondent, Nina Hase. Nina, fill us in here. What's in these intercepted communications from the Russian military?
Well, according to Der Spiegel, the German intelligence service BND informed members of parliament here in Berlin about those intercepted messages on Wednesday. That's how they found out. So the BND, apparently, according to those reports, intercepted radio messages from Russian military personnel where they discussed the killings of civilians in Bucha. Now, some of those radio messages are said to have a direct link to dead bodies that have been photographed in Bucha, to dead bodies found along the main street there. In one case, for example, one soldier is said to be telling another soldier how he and his colleagues had shot down a person from their bicycle. And we all remember that picture of the dead body on a bicycle in Bucha that went viral. And in another message, one man is said to have said that soldiers are first interrogated and then shot dead. This is a Russian soldier speaking in this radio message. So the findings also allege that the Russian mercenaries of the Wagner group are involved in those atrocities. We do not know any more detail on that. But the German intelligence service apparently is also analysing further radio messages from different locations, so not just Bucha. And they could, of course, be further evidence that atrocities like in Bucha are also happening elsewhere in Ukraine, in and around Mariupol in particular. So these findings do support the theory that those atrocities are not individual cases carried out by traumatized Russian soldiers and instead could point at a distinct military strategy by Russia to inflict fear and horror amongst the civilian population in Ukraine.
Nina, thank you very much. Our political correspondent, Nina Hase.